Hello everyone. So we will talk a little bit about regulation, the regulatory landscape that will come in the coming years in Europe, but not only in Europe, also in the UK and in the United States. We have three guests coming here for the panel. One of them, unfortunately, couldn't come in, Peter Grosskopf, the CEO of Immutable. But let me introduce you to our panelists. Dom Hallas, you're the Executive Director of the Coadec, representing startup and scale-up tech companies in public policy debates in the UK. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Florian Wimmer, you're the CEO of Blockpit. You've been working for 4 years at KPMG, and then you needed to make your crypto tax declaration, and you didn't find any solution, so this is why you created Blockpit. And Jonno Evans, thank you for coming. Jonno, you lead Project Vellir. It's an initiative to support growth and innovation in the crypto and Web3 space, with a particular focus on the implication for public policy. So we will talk about regulation. We'll try to make it fun to the audience.
Regulation is fun, Solenne. It's really fun.
In crypto. Yeah, it can be fun. It can be fun. So the objective is really to give a sort of great overview of what's going on and where we're going. Have a sort of feedback from you about what the crypto ecosystem thinks about that regulation. We'll talk a little bit about Luna, if you don't mind, and then to conclude, interesting to see what's going on also in the US and in Asia, and what are the main differences with Europe. So let's start with you, Florent. Can you please remind to us what are the main European regulations? So not too much into the details, but then give an update on where we are and where we're going.
All right. So like 2 years ago, the European Commission introduced an extensive package of regulation for digital finance, also including AI and big data, but also blockchain. And the two big regulations in that package that we're seeing coming up now is the markets in crypto asset regulation, so the MiFID for crypto assets, which mostly deals with the topic of stable coins. The initiator was kind of like the Libra DM Facebook project and trying to regulate that as much as possible, but also includes basically a guideline for financial service providers and how they should act. And the second one is the transfer funds regulation, dealing with the topic of anti-money laundering. Both of them are right now in the trilogues, so we expect them to be finished by the end of June. So this is where we're standing at the moment with the bigger ones. And
what was the objective when the EU decided to launch that MiCAR regulation and to start to dig into that landscape?
I mean, basically what the Commission has to do is protect the citizens, right? To protect the investors and regulate space, to not have a systematic failure when it comes to those new kind of assets. And I think we saw in 2017 when the first hype was coming that this is actually a space that's so big that it needs to be regulated. And you can only regulate the financial service providers, right? You can't regulate the citizens directly. So this is what they are trying to do now with the two big topics of anti-money laundering and taxation.
And in terms of service providers, do we already know what kind of service providers will be, in that regulation, in that MiCAR regulation? So who will need to follow the rules?
Yeah, so they're called crypto asset service providers in the regulation. Who is falling under that? It's not 100% clear. Mostly it's going to be the big exchanges, custodianship providers, so everybody who needs to get a license to offer financial services as we know them from the traditional finance, so everything that has to do with fiat, euro or pound on-ramp, off-ramp within the EU, right? So it's a EU cross-regulation. We're going to have similar things also in the UK, also across. So it is about standardizing as much as possible on a global level. Let's see if we can make that happen. We'll probably know a lot more at the end of June.
Thank you. So I go into the details a little bit more if you don't mind. So we have in Europe registration of what we call virtual asset service providers, or digital asset service provider, depending on the country. So do the actors, so for instance, brokers or custodians, are already registered in some countries? So what is the objective of MyCar? Is it the question of passporting the activities in Europe? And what will happen to those VASP already registered in different countries?
So yeah, it's kind of about passporting. The big topic is stable coins, right? So there's like two different types of stable coins: asset-backed stable coins that could be backed with gold or whatever, and then there's like e-money, which is really like backed by the euro. So those are the big topics that MyCar wants to cover. So they actually like increased now like the threshold on when you are liable to get a license to be able to emit stable coins. I think it's like at $500 million in market cap of those stable coins, when you need to get like this approval of the central bank of the EU to be able to issue those stable coins.
Thank you very much, Florian. That was very clear. Now, Jonno, you know quite well the policymakers. What are the politics of crypto, and how far does the political context has an impact on that regulation? Generally speaking, not only for MyCar, but in general when it comes to crypto.
Yeah, thanks, Solenne, and thanks for having me on the panel. I think it's really clear that sort of crypto is becoming politicized really quite quickly. That's inevitable as more users come on stream and you see more people using the technology. I mean, you can see it in the UK with the Chancellor coming out saying he wants to make the UK a crypto hub. You see it in the US with the White House executive orders and so on. Less so, I think, in the EU at the minute. You see some politicization at the EU level, but it's more at the member state level still, and you haven't really got big voices at the EU level on the political side talking about crypto. I think one of the interesting questions is kind of what is going to be the political or the dominant political narrative that comes out on crypto over the next few years. We all sort of know the origins of crypto in kind of right-wing-ish libertarian type narratives or kind of anti-state rhetoric as well, but it'd be interesting to see whether actually some of the politics around some of the other use cases in crypto, whether that's financial inclusion or privacy or community ownership, start coming through too, and the extent to which crypto can remain politically neutral, I guess, or whether actually one side of the political spectrum dominates the discussion. I think will have potentially quite big implications for the regulatory side. And what you're really seeing is kind of the politics start to play out and the politicians starting to feel they have to come out and start talking about crypto, and regulators can't ignore that. And as users want to use the technology, as we're seeing in the States right now with the recent bills over there, politicians are having to make noise and having to come out on one side of the debate, and regulators will have to start listening to that.
Thank you very much. And we talked a little bit about the US and the executive order from Biden and the UK. Can you tell a little bit more about what's happening in these two countries, Dom?
Yeah, so I mean, in the UK context, I think there's, as Jonno said, there's sort of the announcement from the Chancellor of the government statement of ambition. There's been a lot of kind of ongoing work with the Bank of England, with the Treasury, with the FCA around the kind of stablecoin regulatory space, and some announcements over there. There's also at the same time, and because one of my team was there last week, the sort of ongoing series of crypto sprints that the FCA is doing, where they're bringing in some of the technical experts and having more detailed conversations about sort of future state. So that's where the UK is at the moment, and I think that it's sort of like many jurisdictions in many ways is sort of running to catch up. I think in the US you have a sort of slightly different situation where you did have the executive order, as you say, that has been, relatively positively received from the community and reflected a kind of an announcement and an exploration that agencies should start to think about this stuff. You also more recently have had the Gillibrand Loomis bipartisan proposed bill in the space in Congress, and even though that's it's certainly not going to survive in its current form. It's very wide-ranging. Again, it's a real statement of ambition. I think, at a kind of macro level, when you look at the US compared to the current European state, I think it's fair to say that it's probably actually moving, whilst it's been back and forth, probably moving in a slightly more positive direction at the moment than the European policy conversation. And I think that's really something to reflect on. I think that probably reflects one of the broader challenges that we've seen more generally. So at Coadec, we work across the whole technology ecosystem, and it's a natural state in many ways that policymakers go on a journey of sort of seeing a thing that they don't truly understand. And frankly, in reality, where in the kind of crypto community, we're at the point at which the rest of the technology ecosystem was 10, 15 years ago, where you can count on one hand in many cases the number of regulators who truly know what this stuff is. And that creates a really difficult situation where what people don't know and don't understand in regulatory terms, they're often fearful of. And frankly, that's kind of where we are at the moment, where, you know, the men in grey suits in Brussels, they don't know what it is, but they don't like it. And I think that actually we need to make sure that as a community we're able to engage in a way that allows us to move from that current state of affairs to one that's more productive and, you know, effectively works with regulators in a more constructive way.
Thank you. So when we prepared this panel, I told you that I wanted practical cases and crispy anecdotes. So Dom and Jonno, that would be interesting to tell us a bit more about the way you personally interact with those policymakers. If you have, of course, anecdotes to tell us how it's really practically it is to interact with them and the way they react, the way they train. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So I think the first thing to say is everyone talks about regulation. They often talk about lobbying, and they think those two things are the same. And I suggest to people they really aren't. And having sat in rooms with very senior politicians, including prime ministers in the past, what you often find is if you're lobbying, you're too late, and you've probably missed the boat. And that's not to say there isn't a time and a place for lobbying. If there's a particular bill in Parliament or in trilogues or whatever it may be, it may well be very sensible to go and have the conversation with legislators and see if you can shift the dial a little bit. But the advice I would give is primarily to try and think upstream as far as possible. Go and have conversations with policymakers and regulators as far in advance of that piece of legislation coming down the track as possible, and put yourself in their shoes and think about what their objectives are, because they often have very different objectives to the industry, which might be about building new tools or innovation or thinking about cool stuff. Regulators and policymakers are thinking about something entirely different. So, you know, right now in the UK, one of the big narratives is around levelling up. Well, okay, is there a way that crypto can play into that particular bit of kind of policy making? Is it about, you know, industries of the future in different bits of the UK, or creating, you know, new ways to work with climate tech in different bits of the UK? So can crypto find a way of embedding itself in different sorts of narratives? Equally, maybe on the EU side, it's about strategic autonomy, which the French have talked a lot about, and President Macron with the presidency at the moment. You know, actually Web3 could be a really interesting counterweight to some of the big tech companies in Web2 and could play into that narrative quite well. And so if you can come at these sorts of issues through the lens that policymakers are thinking about them, then I think we'll have much more success rather than sort of coming at this very late and trying to lobby on specific issues. And so my advice as far as possible would be, you know, engage early and engage in a way that policymakers can understand.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I suppose as a lobbyist, I can't say that lobbying is pointless. but I think there's sort of two things. Like, I think there's definitely a huge education job to be done where in reality, and that's as early and as often as possible, in reality, we're not at that stage yet where policymakers truly understand. We're not at the stage, you know, I think there's sort of more work has been done with regulators and they're in a slightly better place in some jurisdictions than others, but that's a huge gap. I mean, I also just think there's sort of a difference in the way in which you can interact with people where, you know, there has to be space for people who work, you know, as politicians or as, you know, officials to ask the dumb questions, right? As in, like, they don't do this every day. This is not their, you know, if you're an MP, you have 101 things to do. And to be honest, this is probably number 80. Like, and how do you create space to allow people to be wrong in a way that isn't judgmental, that isn't like, they're idiots. Like, as in, like, because they're actually just learning, right? As in, they're like further back in the journey than we might be on some of the big topics. So I think that's really, really important. The other thing just to say is I think the distinctions between the way in which different jurisdictions work, the reality is in the UK, if we decided tomorrow that we wanted to pass a piece of regulation on cryptocurrency, the truth is that the government, despite the current chaos, theoretically could just pass that, right? They have an 80-seat majority, they could ram it through Parliament, and within weeks we could theoretically have a piece of cryptocurrency regulation. In Europe, it's a much longer burn, like slower burn process, but once the momentum starts moving, it's like a train, and like once everyone jumps on board, then the train can't be stopped, and it's much more about influencing the direction of the train, and it becomes much more about how do you structure amendments, how do you engage with the permanent representatives, how, you know, what does the kind of niggly bits of work that are required to be done, whereas in national governments quite often it's a much more kind of binary process, like a thing's happening or it's not, and it's about shaping the process before the process happens.
Thank you. Florian, I wanted to ask you a question also. It's interesting to see the way Blockpit is preparing for this, because your solution is rather on taxation and the concerns is rather tax than pure regulation. But how do you prepare yourself for MyCar and for everything that will happen and you don't know really where it's going?
Yeah, I mean, everything like plays together a little bit. In the first time, like in history, we have now access to decentralized data as well as centralized data. So it's mostly about like, gathering that data and processing that data, be it like, anti-money laundering, taxation, and we need software for that. Yeah. The big topic and how it impacts our business the most is like, who is actually affected by that? Because let's say startups in the space that know what they're doing, they're developing software, they are actually looking for licenses and they get those, and suddenly they get massive reporting requirements that they just can't handle, right? Because they would need to invest so much money to be able to stay compliant. So we're gonna see big consolidation and then maybe 15 to 20 players. And it's a difference for us as well if we're serving 50 to 20 players or if we are serving 700 players in the space with our solutions. So it's about trying to also get a little bit in the direction of giving a chance to small players to step up in the space and trying to drag out consolidation a little bit in that regards. We ourselves are not regulated. That's the good thing as a pure software provider, but all our clients are or will be in the future. So we need to prepare, of course, on the side of getting information as fast as possible to be able to serve software solutions for them to actually implement. Because I think the time of implementation and the complexity is pretty underestimated. So you say regulation comes out as a draft, it's gonna enact it 6 months later, and then you have a grace period of 12 months. That's actually really short for a financial service provider to implement technical solutions to be actually able to be compliant once you have to do it.
And do you interact with tax authorities as much as possible, concretely?
Absolutely. I mean, that's still a big issue that tax is a national level, and it will be. So harmonization on a taxation level, it's pretty impossible. Yeah. So, and you need to target it country by country level. Of course, there's regulation coming out like the DAC8, which is EU-wide, and it's basically information exchange between the member states. So let's say an exchange is registered in France and they have a customer out of Estonia, so they would have to provide the data of the Estonian customer to the Estonian tax authorities because they're all part of the EU. So this is going to help a little bit the prosecution, but still you have to map the data to Estonian tax law in that case. So we're trying to harmonize where it's possible, but on the taxation level it's always going to be national.
Big challenge for you. Thank you very much. So interesting to know, because you were talking about other players and your peers. So how would you say that, what is the position of the crypto ecosystem from what you hear of other startups about MyCar?
I think everybody knows we need regulation because right now if we're living in the Wild West, we're never going to achieve mass adoption. That's just not going to be possible. But at the same time, you're a little bit scared of over-regulation. So
of course.
The sentiment, I think, is still positive. We made a few turns on critical points like proof of work ban or the regulation of unhosted wallets, which is still in discussion, but I think the chances are good that this is going to fall out. So once we can be reactive to those big points, you really see people coming together and trying to influence. We saw it over new channels like Twitter, for example, where really regulators are getting spammed under Twitter threads, and it has an impact. So they are more willing to listen if they see the community speaking up, and we see that happening. And I think it's this train that's now started, and we need to keep it in the right tracks.
Thank you, Dom. But talking about a common approach of the different players, there was this open letter to EU representatives. Can you tell us what it says in a sense, and what was the purpose of that letter?
Yeah, so there was a few different things. There was actually quite a lot on the sort of non-custodial wallets, which I think is a big issue and is sort of still under debate. There was quite a lot on kind of privacy preserving protections around what ID can be used for different discussions. There was a lot of discussions on transaction caps to ensure that it wasn't, didn't become overly burdensome on users. So there was a whole mishmash of ideas, and that's because there are a whole mishmash of ideas under discussion, frankly, and sort of ideas are getting thrown in and taken out, and that's a classic European legislative process. I mean, I think that what in many ways is more important and is a reflection on the fact that a bunch of people in the community came together and understood, okay, we have to band and work out how to engage with this European process. And I think that that's going to be an increasing part of the ecosystem going forward, and in many ways reflects a sort of professionalization of the ecosystem in understanding, okay, this is going to happen now, how do we effectively collaborate, coordinate, and engage with regulators? And that's a journey that the technology ecosystem as a whole has gone on, right? Like, as in, that's the same journey that many of the Web 2 companies have been on already, where to start with, I worked on the GDPR in Brussels back in 2014, and you used to see, lobbyists from tech companies turning up in shorts to meetings. And, gradually people learned, it turns out that the men in gray suits in Brussels, they don't like that. That doesn't play. And so understanding how to effectively interact in a constructive way, but also giving the flavor of the ecosystem and leveraging the community of people who use crypto that are a huge power. One of the things we've seen really effectively in the States is mobilizing users in some of these conversations is going to be an increasingly important part of the policy conversations and the interactions with policymakers going forward.
Okay, Jonno, to close that ecosystem discussion, what would you say the industry is wrong right at the moment?
What's it getting wrong? Well, look, I think it's doing a lot of things right, actually, and this conversation's exposing some of that, and I think it is beginning to sort of get itself organised and coordinated. I think I'd make 3 points. I mean, first, there is still quite a lot of sentiment around about the idea that somehow crypto can be self-regulated or doesn't need any regulation. I think that's for the birds. And I think, Florian, your point about, actually regulation is probably going to be a good thing for the industry, and it's going to enable mass adoption. I think that is a really important message that the industry should accept and sort of move forward with and say, look, we understand and we recognise regulation is important, and we want to work with you to deliver it. Second point, I think the industry needs to get really, really organised, and that is starting to happen, and you're starting to see that through things like the letter that Dom was talking about. But at the minute, if you talk to regulators, often they'll say, well, we don't really know what the industry wants. We think there's some issues to deal with, but we hear that the industry doesn't really like what we're doing, but there's not a coherent message that says, okay, well, if we're going to regulate it, here's the way we should do it. Here's how you should interact with audits and smart contracts and use the data that's out there publicly, or whatever it might be. So I think there's a kind of organisational layer to the industry that needs to be built. And then finally, sort of slightly harking back to what I said before, I think it does need to get political as well. And at the minute, there's a degree of sort of slight naivety about how the industry's operating. And I think that's just because it's new, and that's understandable. But getting savvy and getting political is going to be a really important next step too. So hopefully, if you can bring all those things together with what Dom and Florian have already said, then we're heading in the right directions.
I was just going to say, I think that's absolutely right. I think that infrastructure layer, as Jonno just put it, which is how do you, as a relatively young industry, the right institutions get built to engage with policymakers in the right way and translate the views of the community in many cases, that whether you have these kind of two big, different kinds of communities, you have the crypto community and then you have policymakers, and, never the twain shall meet in reality, and when they do, they probably fight with each other. And it's how do we build something in between that is telling that story of the community and explaining things in a way that's coherent to policymakers and that they can action, right? What levers are they supposed to pull and which ones aren't they supposed to pull?
Okay, so there is something I would have to say to you is when back in 2008, when I was working in the banking industry, I really suffered from the subprime crisis as an investor. At that time, I was an investor. And I was happy in the end that the regulation started to implement strong processes. So I would say I'm not against regulation, I'm favorable. When I look at what is happening right now in crypto, I find it very exciting, but I see a lot of systemic risks. And what happened to Terra Luna and what we experienced those last weeks was a bit, shock, not a surprise for many people, I believe, but I would say a sort of wake-up call on the way it could really destroy companies and destroy part of the ecosystem. So there is a good way a good framework to put in place for DeFi. but I would say rather lighter than for TradFi. What's your position on this? What do you think should be regulated, and who should be regulated in DeFi?
Yeah, I can take that one to start, I suppose. I mean, I think this also, I have a few points on this. I think that the first thing to say is just like, it's just going to be incredibly difficult. Like, the reality is this is going to be really, really difficult. True decentralization makes regulation really bloody hard. But at the same time, you know, so just for example, base level is like, where are these located? Which jurisdictions still remain, you know, it's going to be cool. Like, what I will say, and I think it cuts to the conversations that we've been having, is regulators are going to bloody try, right? Like, as in, they're going to regulate something, like, and so it's in truth, like, it's about then, you know, it's contingent on the community to think about these questions and present solutions, precisely because otherwise solutions are going to be presented. And I mean, you know, I don't claim to have all the answers on this. I think that the reality is, in these fast evolving areas, it's hard to know where it's going to end up, let alone where it is now. And so, but I do think that it's sort of the start of these conversations with the community are so critical, precisely because the train has started and it's going to be coming. And so what does that really mean?
Yeah, I mean, the Terra Luna disaster showed us how young the space is, right, and how fast it is developing. And I think you need to get regulation out step by step. We're seeing it now with Micro, DeFi, NFTs are probably not gonna be in it because, as he said, it's like so hard to regulate. Who do you regulate? Right now you can only regulate the regulated players in your jurisdiction, right? Which would be the virtual asset service provider. And this is where you have to start. And I think this is also where, if we really come to a size where it's like system critical, right? Where the people are gonna flood in and where you have to filter out the bad actors in the beginning. And I personally believe that like decentralized stablecoins, like Terra Luna was trying, is something that will exist in the future. I think you can't fully regulate it down to nothingness, but it has to achieve a certain size to not be able to be destroyed as easily as it has been the case with Terra Luna. I think it took around like $3 billion to like make the House of Cards crumble. A big topic here is definitely when it comes to the EU, stable coins pegged to the euro, which is a big problem right now because you have negative interest rates. So it's not a sustainable business for any private company to issue a euro-backed stablecoin, even if they can get the license of the European Central Bank. And it makes us really vulnerable compared to the dollar, right? So suddenly everybody is still gonna interact with a stablecoin that's based on the dollar because it's programmable money until we have like CBDCs. But I think CBDCs in themselves pose a lot of risks, especially when it comes to data privacy and it's really this sort of Damocles, right, or this two-sided sword, where we need to find a solution that's still like values privacy but would work as intended as programmable money.
I mean, I think there's a reason why regulators focused on stablecoins first. I think the Terra Luna stuff has sort of proven why that was the right thing to do. And you know, the UK has been thinking about regulating stablecoins for a little while, and a bill will come out this summer. Financial Services Bill will include legislation to that effect around capital requirements and liquidity requirements and so on. So I think all of that is moving in the right direction. I think that, and by the way, I think that is all going to be a benefit to the sector. You know, a well-regulated stablecoin sector is a good thing, I think, and it will enable growth and adoption more widely of some of the DeFi technology. So I think that is a good place to start. I mean, Florian's point on CBDCs I think is really interesting, because I think what some of this Terra Luna stuff will do is open a conversation about the extent to which, you know, CBDCs are a good thing or a bad thing, and should actually we be speeding up some of the move towards CBDCs, or is it the case that by regulating stablecoins, those are working sufficiently well that we don't need CBDCs in the future? And I don't know which side of that debate will win out, but it seems plausible to me that, you know, people sitting in the Bank of England or in the ECB are thinking, wouldn't mind playing around with a CBDC, thanks very much. It could be quite fun to have programmable money and negative interest rates on chain. And well, if, you know, private companies can't make stablecoins work, we'll have a go. So I think you could well see CBDCs sort of the timeline towards those speed up, and that will have real implications for the rest of the sector. So I think it's an interesting one to watch.
Interesting if we go back to Terra Luna case, how did the different parts in the world, the US, Asia, in Europe, the UK react after that case? Did we see reactions from the regulators, the policymakers? Do you know that?
So I mean, certainly in the UK, I think the argument would be, in a sense, didn't necessarily need to react because there was already a plan to legislate for stable coins. The Financial Services Bill was already planned. The Queen's speech happened very recently, but all of that work had been done many months previously by the Treasury and others. So I think the reaction in the UK was relatively muted. In the US, it's a different story, and I think Janet Yellen was actually in Congress when the crash happened, saying
she was well prepared.
She was well prepared, and this thing's going on, and of course we want to bring forward legislation this year. That won't happen in the US, given it's an election year, so there's no way there's legislation in the US this year, but there certainly has been a reaction to it, and you've seen that in the Loomis-Gillibrand bill. And in the EU, I mean, Florian, you're probably better placed to speak about it, but it feels to me like, yes, there has been a reaction, but it's all wrapped up in the wider MiCA stuff, so people sort of saw it coming, but it's added a sense of urgency to that process.
But I think one of the things that's a real challenge is, like, Terra is an algorithmic stablecoin. A lot of the conversations that are being had in terms of policy making is fundamentally about fiat-backed coins, and I don't, so in many ways, like, the FCA commented, but actually, and all of the stablecoin work that, as Jonno said, is ongoing in the UK, is still fundamentally structured around the fiat-backed conversation. I think that's the thing that what we're going to quite often see is, and it's a natural part of technology regulation, is what we'll get is a sort of level of whack-a-mole to a certain extent, where issues will pop up, regulators will try and whack or try and say something, and that's totally sensible and totally pragmatic, but like there's still going to be, I don't know whether Florian or Jonno knows better than me, but most of the kind of stablecoin regulatory conversations that are happening globally are unrelated to algorithmic stable coins, and so I think that's the real challenge, is kind of, we see emerging challenges and regulators are perhaps a step behind, but they're going to get there, and so what do we do to shape those conversations?
Yeah, it's like how it's written in MiCA, right? We have asset-backed stable coins that could be backed by different currencies or baskets or debt or precious metals, and then we have like the fiat-backed stable coins. But we're not talking about algorithmic stable coins, and
right.
They are actually backed by financial incentives in the system for arbitrage traders to keep the peg. That was like how Terra was meant to work out, and it was kind of going into the direction of actually being a decentralized central bank. So they bought Bitcoin as a reserve, right? They were planning to buy more assets as a reserve, so it kind of worked, or should have worked, like a decentralized bank. It was way too small though, like $40 billion, so the bank run was easy to fabricate. And I think that there is going to be other contenders trying to go into that direction, not backing it with an actual asset, but backing it with like incentives within a system.
Excellent. So we will keep some time for the questions. So last question on my side to conclude. We were talking about the right balance between business and regulation. Sometimes, and I can tell you because I personally lived it in the banking area 20 years ago, it was really easier to serve clients there now because it's much more complex. So when we do a parallel with the crypto environment, what would be, in your opinion, the do's and don'ts? So what would make sense and what would be a complete nonsense in terms of regulation? If you could say so, and be transparent.
Well, happy to start. I think one interesting way to think about this is trying to make or differentiating between what some people have called crypto regulation, where the aims are basically to prevent activity in this sector through regulatory means and systems, and differentiate that with crypto regulation, which is about enabling activity and innovation to take place using regulated systems, whether that be licenses to operate or other things. And I think that's an interesting and useful framework, which is to say we are going to have regulation, but let's not have regulation that prevents activity taking place. Let's focus on regulation that enables activity to take place in a safe environment. And I think you can start to see how that could play into things like DeFi and other areas through using audits of smart contracts or checking through incentives that actually what people are saying they're offering to consumers they actually are doing, or opening databases for regulators to look at. And so it's kind of new ways we could think about using the technology to support regulation, but I think having a kind of overall objective, which is to enable activity rather than prevent it, is the right way to start.
Any idea, Florian?
Yeah, I think like a big mistake is trying to apply existing regulation to something as new as crypto. So we're always talking about like regulation needs to be technology neutral, and I agree, but there is new technology coming in that hasn't been there before, and we are doing it on an EU level with MiCA, like really going and making new regulation, but on a member states level, we're far away from that. So in Austria, we actually had the first tax reform that really now mentions crypto specifically. All the other jurisdictions, they are applying existing regulation, and we see it not working out. So I think this is one of the biggest mistakes we could make, is trying to just pressure it into something that's already existing. We need to think about it as something completely new that needs its own regulation.
So can you please clarify? That's not clear to me. Can you please re-explain to me if that was not clear about the fact that each member state can have, because a regulation is a European approach. You don't need to transpose it into local law. So
for tax regulation, for example,
yes,
we have a national application, and we have like stocks, and we have precious metals, and we have fiat currency, and we're trying to adapt those existing regulation to tokens and coins and decentralized assets. And that's not working out, because we have now suddenly like staking and liquidity pooling and whatever you can do in a decentralized ecosystem, and you can't apply the existing regulation to things like that. So we really need to think as finding new regulation, not trying to like find a box where it fits, right? And a lot of member states are still doing that.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is sort of relatively simple point, but you have to actually have a plan, right? Like, as in, one of the biggest challenges we've seen so far is, and Florian's at the sort of forefront of this in many ways, is seeing the kind of tax policy car driving the crypto policy, the horse, and it's to mix metaphors, like, as in, and that's partially because tax is in many ways like the first through the wall in terms of things impacted by this changing landscape, right? And so quite often you have the taxman, and certainly HMRC in the UK, essentially by definition making policy for the rest of the ecosystem, because they just have to do something because these things are happening to them, instead of thinking holistically about, okay, well, where are we going to be in 5 years' time? What does the reality of the increasing decentralization of things like DAOs going to, what is that going to mean for policy? Where will DeFi go? And so, without that understanding, and without a sort of, you're not going to necessarily know the end point today, but you can start to set the framework for some of those conversations. And, in many ways, you don't want things to be out of date, but I definitely think there's a sort of sense in which there'll be a kind of holding pattern of regulation to begin with a view to understanding that things are going to evolve and that policymakers will have to come back to it. Whatever conversations are happening in Europe or in the UK or anywhere in the world now, that's not going to be the end point of this regulatory conversation. That's going to be very much the start, and so we all have to bear that in mind.
Can I just add one quick thing very briefly, which is, we haven't talked a lot about clarity actually on this panel so far, but I mean, adding on to what Dom's just said, I think that is one of the most important points here, is to provide some clarity to the sector. In a sense, the rules matter to some extent, but clarity over what they are and certainty that they're going to be in place for a little while allows people to build around them and function sensibly. So I think, if there's one message for regulators, it's also about clarity as soon as possible.
Definitely.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful and interesting. We have time left for questions. I don't know if you can raise your hand if you have any question.
We were that insightful.
No questions left.
I have one question. So
There's one at the back.
There's one.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to ask a question. Is are regulated and decentralized in conflict?
I'm happy to start on that. I think they can be. There are ways in which they can be in conflict. For instance, if you are a fully decentralized DAO, it's not always clear exactly which jurisdiction that bit of code might sit in, or who is running that project and where tax should be paid, or if a regulator wants to regulate the entity, who is it coming after? So I think in some cases where there are fully decentralized protocols or platforms, then there can be a tension. But I think one of the aims over the next few years for the regulatory space is to try and reduce the gap between those two things and make them as compatible as possible. And so things like enabling DAOs to register and become sort of have legal personhood in some way in different jurisdictions will have a real impact on that, and will enable some of those gaps to be closed, because there can be issues that arise.
Yeah, I think there are like two sides to this, right? So if you are regulated, you also win trust and some other things. And then if you're not regulated, you can act more freely. And I think there will always be like players that choose the side of regulation. And if it's possible to regulate the DAO within the EU, some will gonna do it. And some will just go to a jurisdiction where there is no taxes, there's no regulation, they can stay anonymous, right? So we're always going to have those two sides. We have them right now in the traditional markets as well. And so, yeah, I agree completely with what you said.
Thank you very much. Any question?
Oh, we have one.
Yeah, hello. Now, I was thinking traditionally regulation has been double-sided, sort of always protecting the public, but also for the authorities to gain from the advantage of having the monopoly over the space and the territory. So, for taxes, for example, what was taxed typically were places they could control, like passages over, the tolls on ferries and things that, the places there, they could control the passage of things, of merchandise and people. So of course, the regulation in that aspect of gaining from the traffic and the trade, it's linked to their ability to controlling, and that's they will lose that with the decentralization. And inevitably, you could say, that will happen. So, still, I think that's a real issue. Is it possible with decentralization going far and the authorities having control to such extent that they can tax and regulate individual trading flows?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I think that's probably right. Like, it's one of the reasons, frankly, that so many of the conversations around regulation, whether it's in the stablecoin space or whether it's in the tax space, often come down to on and off ramps with fiat, right? Like by definition, it's because it's the place that the regulators can see most visibly. I mean, I think in terms of the once you get into true decentralization, what will happen? Will regulators be able to access this stuff? The honest answer is that's kind of the conversations that people are now starting to have in a way that they weren't having before in regulatory terms. And I mean, I guess whilst on the one hand, I can't necessarily envisage a world where that's immediately possible. What I would say is, don't sort of underestimate the power of the regulatory state when required. And the reality is that if regulators truly feel and if governments truly feel that they need to re-exert control, there are mechanisms and will continue to be mechanisms that they are able to leverage in order to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We don't have time left. Thank you. That was very, very interesting. And I guess if everyone has a question, you can directly contact us
Absolutely.
on LinkedIn or Twitter.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.